Are you interested in buying a low watt tube amp for your stereo system, but you're just not quite sure how it will sound in your current stereo setup? Well, a couple months ago, I received a 6 watt per channel tube amp from PJ Miaolai. It's the 6G2P model, and I'm going to be honest with you, I've been on quite the journey trying to integrate this into my stereo system. Now, there are a couple things I learned along the way that I wanted to share with any newbies out there who may be considering buying one of these amps. I'm a newbie myself, and I have a few questions for the tube aficionados out there who may be watching, and I'm hoping they will leave some answers for me in the comments below when we get to that section of the video. Lastly, I want to tell you overall how this amplifier sounds and whether or not you should consider buying it. Let's jump right into those two things that I learned next. Now, the first and most important thing that I have learned over the last few months with this amp is that speakers matter. They really, really matter. More importantly, the sensitivity level of your speakers matter. If you look online at the specs of this amplifier, it will tell you that it performs better with speakers with a sensitivity level of 89 decibels or higher. Now, I'm going to explain this more when I talk about how the amplifier sounds, but I ran this with 3 sets of speakers and it went from bad to great. So if you're someone that is looking for a low watt tube amp, but you have not really looked at what speakers you currently own, you need to make sure that you spend time to look at the sensitivity levels of the speakers you own, because you could buy one of these affordable low watt tube amps, get it home, hook it up to speakers with a sensitivity level that are in the 80s and really not like it. Then you're going to find yourself having to go out and buy speakers with a higher sensitivity level and spend more money. So tip number 1, look at the sensitivity level. With these low watt tube amps, you're going to want something 90 decibels or higher. Now, tip number 2 is music matters. And what I mean by that is your musical taste matters. A low watt tube amp represents sound a lot different than a high powered solid state amplifier. And if you have found yourself like I do, where you get in a rabbit hole and you see these really cool looking low powered 2 watt per channel tube amps, I'm looking at you, Deckware. I've been down those rabbit holes and I really want to buy one, but I know it's not going to be available for 5 years, so I still haven't pulled the trigger. Anyway, if you're used to high powered solid state gear that's really giving you a lot of bass and power for your rock music or hip hop or EDM, before you go jumping into buying a low watt tube amp, you're going to want to maybe see if you can take your music, see if you can find a friend with one of these amplifiers, listen to it there, and see if it's going to represent it in a way you like it. Because there's a chance that it's going to offer you a lot of detail, but there will be some sound differences that you may not enjoy. And I'd hate for you to go buy one of these thinking that it's going to represent all of the genres that you listen to the best way possible. I love listening to this amplifier with jazz, acoustic, folk. It got me a lot of great detail. But there were times when I would pull out, let's say, an album by The Roots or Beastie Boys, which I'll mention later, and I would know as I'm pulling it out that it would probably sound better on a solid state amplifier and wonder if I should have hooked one up instead. So that's what I'm saying. Your music matters. If you listen to a lot of bass driven music, really take that into consideration before buying one of these low watt tube amps. Okay, real quick, this next section is for my tube aficionados out there who have owned a lot of tube amps over the year. I have a few questions for you. Let's jump into those next. Now, my first question has to do with biasing. One of my favorite books on high-end audio is The Complete Guide to High-End Audio, written by Robert Harley. While I was reading up on tube amps in that book, he states that, and I think this is a well-known fact, that tube performance is going to change over time and tubes fail at different times, and often you need to bias the amplifier, and that's available with trimmer pots located on the unit. Now, with this unit, I cannot find any trimmer pots on the actual chassis itself. He emailed the manufacturer asking if it would auto bias, and honestly, at this price point, I don't think it does, and they never got back to me on that answer. So my question for you is, with something like this unit is made in China. I think it's definitely for beginners. Is this something I should think about having to bias over time? And if so, is that going to require me having to take the bottom off, get in there and figure it out? There are no instructions. This is it. This is all that came in the box. So I'm really kind of lost on this. I would love for you to leave me a comment below and let me know what you think about biasing on this unit. My second question is, I know it's really common to roll tubes, i.e. change them in and out and hear how they sound different. Now, the rectifier tubes on this unit are 6Z4, the pre-stage tubes are 6G2P, and the post-stage tubes are 6P13P. Had to read those off the back of the instruction manual here. So now that you know what the different types of tubes are inside, how familiar are you with these? Are they worth swapping out? Should I look into rolling some different ones in there? If so, give me your suggestions as to which ones that may sound great with this. The website for this actually gives some recommendations, but I always prefer to hear it from people who may have more experience than I do in tube rolling and get an idea about what may make this amplifier sound even better. Question number 3. For my tube aficionados out there with tube amps, do you guys pair subwoofers with these amplifiers? Because I'm wondering how that would impact the bass performance on these. Now, I'm currently running them with Klipsch Heresy speakers, which most people suggest pairing with a subwoofer. And now that I've got a tube amp that is most well known for never providing as much bass as solid state, I'm curious if I should just break down and buy a subwoofer. I've been shopping, looking at REL subs. I think the cheapest one's like $500, so I'm gonna have to figure out something to sell, maybe to buy one of those and integrate it into the system. But is it common to pair a subwoofer with a tube amplifier like this? I would love for you to let me know in the comments below. Okay, so let's talk about overall how this amplifier sounds. Now, it's important to note that when I first plugged this thing in, it sounded awful. It really needs time to burn in. I'd say 10 to 12 hours. You don't have to be playing music that entire time, but just let those tubes get really good and warmed up, because the very first thing I listened to, I was highly disappointed and thought this thing was a piece of junk. And then about a day later, after letting those tubes burn in, it really started to sound great. So keep that in mind if you buy one of these and hook it up immediately. Also important, going back to what I was talking about earlier, is that speakers really matter with this amplifier. I tried 3 sets of speakers with it: Emotiva B2 Plus, the Klipsch RPM 600 Mark II, and my recently purchased vintage Klipsch Heresy speakers from 1984. Now, these all have varying sensitivity levels, and I think that plays a part in how I want to explain how each sound to you with this amplifier. The first thing I listened to was Tom Petty's Hard Promises album with the Emotiva B2 Plus speakers. Now, I really enjoy these speakers with solid state gear. They have a sensitivity level of 88 decibels. And unfortunately, that meant it was just a poor pairing with this amplifier. Everything sounded hollow, kind of sounded like I was listening to the album in a boombox, and it sounded like things were lagging a bit. Like it just was a bad pairing. And that makes sense because look, even on these fancy instruction thing here that I get, it'll tell you to pair them with 89 decibels or more. So I knew I was pairing these with, that it was gonna be a poor match, but I wanted to know why and hear the sound difference. And that's what I got. Now next, I paired it with the Klipsch RPM 600 Mark II speakers. On paper, these say they're rated at 94 decibels. You can go down a rabbit hole on YouTube and on Klipsch ratings, and what I understand is you should probably knock off 4 to 6 decibels on that rating based on the way Klipsch measures their speakers. So that puts it kind of close to the Emotiva B2 Plus. However, I did find that the Mark IIs sounded better than the Emotiva speakers. They held their own. I enjoyed them a lot more. I really felt like I was starting to kind of get a taste of what this amplifier could do. But I knew I could probably do even better, and that led me to purchasing my vintage Klipsch Heresy speakers from 1984. Now these have a decibel rating of 90 dBs. They also have a squawker horn. And what I found with these speakers is that these really brought out the detail in the upper frequencies and mid-range. I really enjoyed the way these speakers pair with this amplifier. And it was at this point when I forgot that this amplifier was like a $300 amp. You know what I mean? Like, to me, it sounded like it should be a lot more expensive once I paired everything up properly. Now, all tube amps have sort of the same problem, and that's they don't bring out the bass. Part of the reason why I was asking earlier about if I should add a subwoofer is, would that help take care of this problem and probably make this kind of the perfect system? Because what I found was, for instance, I put on my OG copy of Licensed to Ill by the Beastie Boys, which is obviously not an audiophile recording, but it's got a lot of bass in it, and I was just curious how it would sound. And the album sounded fine, but you could definitely tell that the bass was not there as it would be if I was powering this with a high-powered solid-state amplifier. And this was what I found throughout playing a lot of rock music and hip-hop. I did not like the bass reproduction. I just knew that it was lacking. So if bass is very important to you, you really need to take that into consideration before investing in one of these low watt tube amps. What I found that I enjoyed listening to the most was jazz or acoustic music, anything that required a lot of detail. That's where this amplifier and the Klipsch Heresy speakers really shine and make things really enjoyable to listen to. A couple things that I'd like to mention before I wrap up this section about sound. One is that when listening to this, I used my Shit Saga Plus preamp, which has a passive mode, and that's where I hooked all my components to, because that passive mode kind of gets out of the way, and I feel like really helps me hear the sound of the tube amplifier at its finest without kind of interfering too much with a preamp that may have its own particular sound. Another thing worth noting is that I found the volume to be very adequate on this. I think people worry that you can't get these little low watt tube amps loud enough. I certainly did. Oftentimes I find myself turning it down. So if you have the right speakers paired with these, again, sensitivity level 90 decibels or higher, I think you'll find that the volume will be adequate, like halfway. I did turn the knob up louder than I normally do with solid state gear, but I got it loud enough and oftentimes find myself turning it down. Now, some of you may ask how this amplifier compares to the amps that you may find on Amazon. I'm thinking like the Rising amps, those that are in sort of the $400-500 range, the tube amps available there. I have yet to be able to listen to one of those amps, so I don't think it's fair to make a comparison in this video with this tube amp. Now, lastly, it's worth noting you can actually connect a pair of headphones to this amplifier. I'm not a big headphone guy myself. I've got my old beat up pair that I use for when I'm DJing, but I haven't quite gone down that rabbit hole of expensive headphones because everybody's got a budget and mine went to Heresy speakers, okay? I'm not buying expensive headphones right now. Based on what I hear with these speakers, I do think it would be very pleasant to listen to with a very expensive set of headphones, I imagine. But like I said, I don't have those, so I didn't plug them up for this review. But keep that in mind if you're a big headphone person and also want to connect these to speakers, you would have the option to do both. So who should buy this amplifier? If you're someone that has high sensitivity speakers already in your system, and you've been looking to add a low watt tube amp to it just to see how it sounds, I think you'll be pleasantly surprised with this amplifier. It reproduces sound, especially jazz and acoustic, with great detail in the upper and mid range, and I've really enjoyed listening to it. What I would advise anyone that does not have high sensitivity speakers is either be ready to buy a pair of those if you buy this amplifier, or know that it's probably not going to be the best match, especially if your speakers are in the 80 decibel range. I think you're going to find it lacking. And I'd hate for you to watch this, get excited, go buy this amplifier, and just be frustrated that you then have to go spend more money to find a pair of high sensitivity speakers. So keep that in mind when considering buying this amplifier. Also, I think it's worth repeating what I said earlier, that music really does matter. If you're someone that listens to a lot of bass-heavy music, whether it be rock music, metal, EDM, or hip-hop and rap, you may want to listen to your music on one of these amplifiers at a friend's house, something along those lines, to make sure it sounds the way you want it to sound. You could buy this amp, pair it with high-sensitivity speakers, throw all your favorite genres at it, and find that it's just a little lacking, especially if you're not interested or if it doesn't pair well with a subwoofer, something I can't quite speak to. So keep that in mind. You know, we can get wrapped up in thinking we've got to buy a certain piece of gear only to get it home and realize it's not the best match for the music we love listening to the most. So I would advise some caution there before you purchase one of these amps. All that to say that I have really enjoyed the last few months with this amplifier, but I'm really now interested in moving it out of the system and putting in my vintage Macintosh MC2505 solid state amplifier and hear how that sounds with the vintage Klipsch Heresy speakers. Now, that Macintosh amp is one that I will never sell, and I explain why in this video here.